Hello everyone, my name is Matt Flummer and I am Professor of Philosophy at Porterville College, and this is a video that is part of a series on categorical logic. If you haven't already checked out the videos on categorical propositions, then I would recommend that you do so. It will help you understand this video. This is a video on syllogisms, and so let us take a look at what makes a syllogism. We've talked about categorical propositions already, and a categorical proposition, as you'll recall, is a proposition that relates to categories of things. A syllogism is just an argument with two premises. In the case of a categorical syllogism, it is a syllogism that is composed of categorical statements. Pretty straightforward. In order to be a standard form categorical syllogism, the argument must contain two premises, as we said before, and a categorical conclusion. It also must use three different terms, each used exactly twice. And remember from the previous videos, a categorical proposition is composed of terms, the subject term and the predicate term. That is what we are referring to here for the three different terms, the subject terms and the predicate terms of the premises and the conclusion. There will be three different terms in a categorical syllogism that's in standard form, and each of those is going to be used exactly twice. All right, here's an example. All dogs are mammals. All mammals are warm-blooded. All dogs are warm-blooded is our argument. We have three categorical statements, two premises and a conclusion, and each of the terms is used exactly twice. So we have three terms: dogs, mammals, and warm-blooded. And each one of those terms is used twice. So this is a standard form categorical proposition. The first thing that we need to learn about standard form categorical syllogisms is the major, minor, and middle terms. In any standard form categorical proposition, the major term is always going to be the conclusion in your argument. That's how you identify the major term, the conclusion of the argument. The minor term is the subject term of the conclusion. It's really simple. Major term is the predicate of the conclusion, and the minor term is the subject of the conclusion. The middle term is always going to be the term that is not found in the conclusion. So in this argument, meth dealers is a term that is not found in the conclusion. So that makes it the middle term. Criminals is your major term, and the minor term is ex-teachers. Now there's also a major and a minor premise. And the major premise is the premise that includes the major term. It's very simple, right? The minor premise is the premise that includes the minor term. So notice, our major term is criminals. So the premise that includes criminals is premise 1. So that means that is the major premise. Our minor term is ex-teachers. And the premise that includes ex-teachers is the second premise. So that makes the second premise the minor premise. Okay, so that's major, minor, and middle. The next thing we need to know is the mood. In order to determine the mood, you must first put the major premise first. So this makes it officially standard form. In order to be a standard form categorical syllogism, not only do you have to have three terms each mentioned twice, but you have to have the premises in the correct order. And the correct order is the major premise listed first. This is important because if you do not have the major premise first, you might get the mood wrong. The mood is determined by the letter names of the proposition. If you'll recall, there are 4 different standard form categorical propositions, and each one of those has a letter name. So the A proposition is all SRP, the E proposition is no SRP, and the I proposition, like we have here in our first premise, is some SRP. The O proposition is some S are not P. So those are our 4 letter names that we're talking about. In order to determine the mood, all you have to do is figure out what the letter names of the propositions are. So in this one, we've got an I proposition, an E proposition, and an O proposition. So the mood in this one is just I, E, O. It's very simple. That's what we mean when we refer to the mood of a proposition, the letter names of the proposition. Here's another example. So take a look at these premises and see what letter name these are. These are all A's. And so the mood is the AAA mood. Very simple and straightforward. All right, the next thing that we have to learn is called the figure. And the figure is determined by the location of the middle term in the argument. Let me go back to this one. So in this one, animals is our major term. Dogs is our minor term, because remember, the major term is the predicate of the conclusion. The minor term is the subject of the conclusion. The middle term is the term that is not found in the conclusion. In this case, it's mammals. And what I mean by the location of the middle term is whether or not it is the subject term or the predicate term of the premise that it's in. In this argument, the middle term is the subject term of the first premise, and it's the predicate term of the second premise. So that's the location. And in order to determine the figure, we match it to this chart that's found in section 5.1 in the book. So notice here, we've got the major premise up here in this row right here. The minor premise is in this row, and the conclusion is in the bottom row. If the middle term is the subject term of the major premise and the predicate term of the minor premise, then that is figure 1. So this column, this entire column here is figure 1. If the middle term is the predicate of both the major and the minor term, as we have here, major and minor premise, excuse me, then this is going to be figure 2. If the middle term is the subject term of the major premise and the subject term of the minor premise, then that makes it figure 3. And if the middle term is the predicate term of the major premise and the subject term of the minor premise, then that makes figure 4. And you can kind of see a pattern here where we've got a diagonal for figure 1 going this direction, a diagonal for figure 4 going in this direction, and both predicate terms in figure 2, both subject terms in figure 1 on top of each other. So you can kind of see like a pattern to help you understand what we're talking about. So if we were to go back to our dog example, where we have mammals as our middle term, and it is found in the subject term of the first premise and the predicate term of the second premise. That makes this figure 1. Figure 1, we have the subject term of the first premise, predicate term of the second premise. So it's figure 1. Let's look at another example. In this argument, let's do the mood first, and then we'll do the figure. All we have to do in order to figure out the mood, well, we got to make sure that we have our major term first. So our major term is painters, and painters is found in the first premise, so that's the major premise. We're good to go. This is in standard form. Our letter names in the propositions in this argument are E, I, and O, so the mood is E-I-O. Our middle term is sculptors, and it's found in the predicate term of the major premise and the subject term of the minor premise. So let's take a look at the chart. When we've got the predicate term of the major premise and the subject term of the minor premise, that is figure 4. So this one matches figure 4. We've got this kind of diagonal going here. All right, so our mood was E-I-O. Our designation is EIO4. So our middle terms, the location of the middle terms determined the figure. And when we designate an argument, arguments are always going to have designations when we're doing categorical syllogisms. The designation is always listed with the mood first and then the figure. So our mood is EIO4. And that's what we mean by designating a syllogism. You can use mood and figure to test the validity of a categorical syllogism. And the way that you do that is after you have designated the argument with the mood and the figure, you look at the chart that's found in section 5.1 of the book. Our designation was EIO4. So we look at the chart of unconditionally valid forms. Our figure was 4, so we go to the 4 column, and then we come down, and there is EIO. So this is EIO4. It's found in the unconditionally valid forms. So that makes this an unconditionally valid argument. What do we mean by unconditionally valid? The same thing that we meant in the last section in the previous videos. When we were testing arguments, we made a distinction between Boolean and Aristotelian perspectives. So this chart is giving us arguments that are valid from the Boolean perspective. That's what we mean by unconditionally valid. Valid from the Boolean perspective. All arguments that are valid from the Boolean perspective are automatically valid from the Aristotelian perspective. So if your argument is on this, if the mood and figure is on this chart, then the argument is unconditionally valid. If the argument is not found on this chart, then you look to see if you have universal premises and a particular conclusion. So let's take a look at an example like this. We have two A propositions for our premises and an I proposition for the conclusion. So that makes this the AAI mood. The middle term is found in the subject term of the first premise and the predicate term of the second premise. So that makes this figure 1 because the diagonal is going this way. So our designation is AAI1. If we were to look back at our chart, figure 1 right here, you will not see a mood of AAI. So this is not valid from the Boolean perspective. But we know if you've got universal premises and a particular conclusion, and we do, the premises are universal and the conclusion is particular, then we need to retest it from the Aristotelian perspective, and that's what this chart is for, which is also found in section 5.1. This chart gives us the conditionally valid forms, the arguments that are invalid from the Boolean perspective, but they have universal premises and a particular conclusion. Some of these arguments are going to be valid because the Aristotelian perspective interprets universal propositions about existing things as having existential import. So we need to retest them with this chart. Okay. Our designation for this one was AAI1. So we come over to figure 1. We see AAI right here. So that means that the argument is conditionally valid. And the condition that must be met is over here. So the chart tells you what condition must be met. The subject term of the conclusion must exist. So what's the subject term of the conclusion? Leprechauns. Leprechauns do not exist. So though it is conditionally valid, it's found on the chart, the condition that must be met is not fulfilled. So that means this is an invalid argument. So to review, the first thing that you need to do is make sure that the major premise is listed first. The major premise is the premise that includes the major term, which is the predicate term of the conclusion. Once you know you've got it in the right order, with the major term listed first, you look to see what the letter names of the propositions are. That's going to give you the mood. Then you look at the location of the middle term. And the location of the middle term will tell you what the figure is. Once you have figured out the designation, the mood and the figure, you look at these charts. If it's found on the unconditionally valid chart, you're done. The argument is valid. If it's not found on the unconditionally valid chart, then you look to see if you have universal premises and a particular conclusion. If you don't have universal premises and a particular conclusion, you're done. It's invalid. If you do have universal premises and a particular conclusion, then you look at this chart. These are the conditionally valid forms. If it's found on this chart, then you look over to the right-hand column and see if the condition is met. If the condition is met, then it's valid. If the condition is not met, then it's invalid. And that's how you test validity using mood and figure.